I'm good. Good, thank you. David. I think when I say David, like four people turn. Can we get some cowbell? There we go. Whenever in doubt, just ask David to do something. Okay, so I want to talk about a very complicated, confusing topic, which for years has come up in this community and pretty much every community I've ever visited or been in, and that goes for the church. We're looking at the commandments, we're looking at Jews and Gentiles, our roles as the Bible and as Jewish tradition lays them out for us, so we can put those together. I saw an interesting statement from a Hasidic rabbi in New York. He was coming across the street, and there was, I don't know why somebody was filming this, but they were filming somebody heckling him and saying, hey, we're the real Jews. You guys stole it from us. We're the real Jews. Someone was heckling this Hasidic guy. Without missing a beat and without stopping and arguing about history, he said, if you're Jews, great. Join us. Start doing mitzvot. This guy was stunned. I don't think he expected that to be the answer. But there's a very deep theological presumption that came from that statement. If you're a Jew, great. Do mitzvot. Join us. So we'll talk about that. We'll go through the brief history of the commandments, kind of the sin, the flood, and the remedy, something that happened afterwards, the Jerusalem Council, and then we're going to go forward. So we're going through thousands of years of history in about 45 minutes. So I'm going to have to skip some things, of course. But starting off, what do we know about the commandments? When I say commandments, what do you think? Ten Commandments, right?
Torah.
Who are the Ten Commandments for? Who's commanded what? All of us, some say. Okay. Okay, so are there any other commandments than the 10, or are we just, is that it? Those are the commandments? Six. Okay, so someone says 613. So, Brad, what are the 613?
Go first.
Give me an overview of why we just went from 10 to 613.
Some people say it has to do with gematria and multiplication of it too, but there are lots of the mitzvot we can't observe because we don't have a temple. If you're not a priest, you can't observe the laws of priesthood. If you're not a king, you can't observe the laws of kings. So we observe what we can observe. So there's lots that extends the Ten Commandments are kind of like the outline, and then things fall under that specifically.
Yeah, so he just kind of opened a door, which could be its own study. The Ten Commandments are actually 10 categories. They're 10 categories. Of them, you can find at least 613 commandments that fall into those categories. For instance, we talked about this in the past. Healing on Shabbat is not forbidden. There are 4 different types of healing. 3 of them are permitted. But the reason a lot of healing is forbidden, according to tradition, in some cases when it's not dire, it's because you're grinding something. Grinding is one of the things you can't do on Shabbat. Well, that's not exactly in the Torah, but in the rabbinic process it is. And we're all familiar with Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. We've talked about that before. It's the way the rabbis and the way the New Testament kind of parses Scripture. Okay, so we just went from 10 to 613. Has anyone heard of the Noahide commandments?
Yes.
Okay, so can someone give me a brief overview of what the Noahide? Because now we have what? How many are there?
7.
7.
No, 7.
7. No.
7 commandments.
17 plus 600. So 7. What are the Noahide commandments? Go ahead, Drake.
I believe to abstain from idolatry, eating blood, murder, to establish just courts. I forget the remainder. I think honor your parents. And they break off according to Mishnah Torah into 66 principles.
Yeah. Okay, good. So he just gave a list of them. We'll go through them. Who are the Noahide laws for?
The world.
Everyone. Okay. So that's weird, right? Now we have it's for everyone, not necessarily Jews. In some cases, it's captured in the Ten Commandments, but it's for everyone else. And then we have the Jews who have the 10 Commandments and the 613. All right, we'll make sense of this because there's a lot of confusion. A lot of times people come into this movement, they are confused. I have people who still, even years into this, what am I supposed to keep? What's my job here? If I'm not Jewish, should I convert? Do I need to convert? What's my role? And unfortunately, I think the Messianic movement has not answered that question thoroughly. That's my take. So we're going to go back in history. Creation. mankind was created. Adam, right? Adam, you can look at this in a number of ways. Adam was an actual literal person, or you can take another view, right? There's Midrash, there's Peshat, there's Remez, and so on. You can look at it as humanity was created. And what did we do? We, right out of the gate, started messing up. Killing, idolatry, licentiousness. According to tradition, the two biggest things that led to the flood were idol worship and licentiousness. So right out of the gate, humanity had a problem with these two things. After the flood, which wiped everything out, we got a fresh start. It wiped almost everything out. Well, that's a different teaching. The covenant with Noah was established. And the rabbis realized this covenant with Noah actually is a set of mitzvot and commandments that were given before there was an actual Torah at Sinai. And adding them up, they came to a list of 7, but there are actually quite a lot more. And you can see the discussion in the Talmud. Sanhedrin 56 and 57 more or less cover it. Okay, so we get a fresh start. Noah is now given laws of morality, universal morality for all of humanity. And they're called the Noahide laws, the laws of Noah. B'nai Noah, right? And these are to prevent transgressions and impurity, and they're to prevent licentiousness and idol worship from becoming a thing again. Now we have a set of instructions. Great. But the world is still broken. We still have a significant problem. We have fallen from where we were. We're no longer where Adam was when he was first created. We now have a problem. We have something to fix, and we have a stopgap solution until we can figure that out. So God pulls one guy out of the nations. Remember, Abraham was of the nations. He takes him out, creates a covenant, and says, hey, I'm going to use you and your descendants to do something different. You're going to be tasked with bringing justice, bringing rectification, bringing holiness. You're a people set apart. You're going to be like priests, a kingdom of priests. We're going to use your people to create an entirely new system that's set apart that will start to rectify the problems that Adam broke, right? And from this line will come a Messiah. But there's also going to come a lot of people who are going to keep an extra set of rules, which will help. Go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, why is it called the Noahide laws if Noah revealed them and didn't hide them?
I like it. They gave me a chance to take a sip. I almost spit in water. Very good. So some people do ask, why isn't it not the laws of Adam? Right? And sometimes you'll see that language, but Noahide is what they landed on because Noah was kind of the moment that these were created, and God said, I'm not going to flood the world again with water, but keep these laws.
Each generation at that point, there was basically one priest who dealt with God. Adam was one, Seth was one, and then Noah was one as well. And there were others before him too, before the flood. But Noah was the one at this point that dealt with them, and so I think that's why we really call him that.
Yeah, and for sure, there's like one person God is interacting with at this time. It's an individual basis. So then we see a break-off, like a break-off society. It's no longer keeping just the Noahide laws. Every Gentile in the world is keeping the Noahide, or is being measured by the Noahide laws. Whether or not they keep them, that's the system. And all Jews, whether or not they keep the mitzvot, are measured by the Torah, because this is what God created through Abraham. From this point forward, the 10 Commandments are for everyone at Sinai. So according to Jewish tradition, the 10 Commandments are for Jews. The Noahide laws are for Gentiles. And we're going to fast forward at some point here and get to the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, because I think it clarifies that for us. Right? Make sense so far? So it's for the purpose of rectification. Now we have two people groups as far as the Bible, as far as the covenant is concerned. We have Israel, 10 Commandments, which are 613. And actually quite a bit more when you look at the rabbinic process of how we manage food and all the different types of relationships we have, which I think they make sense. You can find these lists online. It's for the purpose of bringing rectification to the world where Adam caused a fall, right? A break. And eventually, if this breakout society continues, eventually everybody else will start to know God. There'll be people who are aware of the Torah, studying the Torah. There'll be groups like this today. If that group is successful, and of course Hashem has helped over the years, but we've had people who have kept the Torah. We've kept it alive. We've kept this body of knowledge through our traditions. Okay, so you have Israel fixing the problem. You then have everyone else on earth. And these are the Noahides. And the goal is to reduce the amount of impurity that was being created through idolatry and sexual immorality, and then to build civil societies, morality, peace, and justice. So we can take today's Parsha and say that's a very universal Parsha. In some ways, it's very technically Jewish. It's talking about temple systems. But on like a midrashic, homiletic level, everybody should seek justice, right? So we can see how like the Ten Commandments are for the Jewish people, but you can see the wisdom is definitely universal. And there's a reason for that. And we'll come to that. I'll continue with what I'm doing. So the Noahide laws, Drake mentioned some of them. Here they are summarized. There's a long discussion about this, and you can actually find it in various tractates of the Talmud. And I encourage anyone to read them. We have Tractate Sanhedrin over there. It takes a while. It'll take you a month or two. Nevertheless, you can kind of get an idea of how they're working. If you understand the rabbinic mindset and the discussions in the Talmud, you'll then be able to make sense of the New Testament and the arguments and the thought processes. This will be available online, so don't feel like you have to memorize these. Number one is not to worship idols. So we're not doing what we did in the beginning. Think back to that timeline. Don't curse God. Do not commit murder. Do not commit adultery or sexual immorality. So we're going back to those two things that really broke humanity and caused a significant breach. We don't steal and we don't eat flesh torn from a living animal. And there are a bunch of different explanations of that. There may have been times people treated animals very harshly for food, right? They cut apart certain parts and let the animal sit there, and it was not merciful. There's a lot of discussion about some of these. You can see how it's not so simple. What does it mean not to eat flesh torn from a living animal? Well, the Jewish world has categories of this, nevilah, and things that aren't sacrificed properly. But for the Gentile world, there are probably some questions around exactly what does that mean. And then to establish courts of justice. And as Drake shared, I think maybe a year ago now, in his marriage teaching, the Jewish system has a lot to say about Jewish marriage, but it doesn't have a lot to say about Gentile marriage. Zero, as Drake said. Because that is for the Gentile world to figure out. And the Jewish world doesn't have much more to say than, we can share advice, but that's up to you. Whatever you create for marriage, that's what you're supposed to do. God said, go ahead and create that. No problem. We're not going to argue with you. The sages in Sanhedrin, this is where you can find the clean list. But I encourage you, at least if you're going to read and take that book off of our shelf, read the different opinions that went into this. Some people had different lists. They're very instructive because you see those opinions appear in the New Testament. The 7 are what we just went through. Courts of judgment. Don't blaspheme. Don't worship idols. Immorality, bloodshed, robbery, and again, eating a limb of a living animal. So, again, I'm just going to show you one last time before we dive in. The Noahide commandments are for everyone, all people on earth. They're actually encapsulated inside the Ten Commandments. So we can say everybody has to keep them, or should keep them, because they're in the Ten Commandments. Jewish tradition says God then took this breakaway society, Abraham's descendants, and gave them extras to keep. And of course, it's not just 3 extra commandments, there are 3 categories, as we know. The Noahide commandments are almost entirely prohibitive. If you notice, it didn't say you must keep Shabbat, you must observe whatever. It's telling you what not to do. It's trying to set a different expectation for the Gentile world. This is God's mission for Gentiles. So people who say that, oh, Judaism is so exclusive and insular. No, this is God's mission for Gentiles. It's just recorded in the Torah. The rabbis saw it in the Torah and have captured it and recorded it. Interestingly, I have we have a lot of people from different parts of India in my neighborhood. And through this, I was able to have some conversations. And they have a very similar list of universal, if I said universal morality, they have a very similar list. Jewish tradition shares that these were all known at one point by all of humanity, but it became corrupt. It became twisted over time.
Would you say then that when Adam was created, when humanity was created, that the conscience that we have was the original instruction given by God, because it's legitimate that God asked Adam, who told you that you were naked? So that awareness had to come from within, that he had transgressed. So it's not like God's asking too much of us. It's what he originally planned for us. And of course, we're twisted in ways, but we innately know what is right and wrong. And
Yeah.
they are universal.
Yeah, so Jewish tradition takes the approach that everyone had opportunity to keep these. And then if you remember Romans 1, I think Paul is talking
He's
about
been
this.
talking about that.
He's like, you know what? You did your own thing, and I just let you at it. You can do whatever you want to do. And there's a midrash with that. God takes the Torah around to the nations and says, hey, do you want this? And they're like, well, what's in there? And he says, well, you're going to have to stop committing sexual immorality, or whatever the nation was. There was some, right? It's a great midrash. I think Paul is talking about that and what you said. This was plain for everybody. I think the fact that certain religions have a very similar code is interesting. That's a data point that we should look at. But, of course, idolatry is still a thing today. There is still idol worship. I think one thing to know is, if you want to know the mission of Gentiles, in the rabbinic view, you have a potential to nullify and also create idolatry. So your job, Gentiles, is a different part of the battlefield, so to speak. Your job is to interact with and nullify idolatry. Jews are told to stay away from it. You can't benefit from it. The discussion in Avodah Zarah of the Talmud is fascinating because it's very technical. And I see that same technicality in Paul's letters and in Acts 15. But if you want to know what your job is, Jews, we keep mitzvot and we try to fix this break. Gentiles, you go out into the world, the places that we can't, and you attack and nullify idolatry and start turning the world back over to create a new baseline for when the nations become redeemed in full. So there's work to do. And the Ten Commandments are for Jews. It's Noahide plus. And of course, a lot of these are measures to preserve and protect holiness. Not to say that Gentiles can't also do some of these commitments. You can't go into a book of Jewish rules or Musar and start practicing things. There's no problem with that. The Talmud talks about that. Someone who does what they're not asked to do, the Talmud says a Gentile who takes on more is like a high priest. So there's runway for you to do things, and we'll get more into that. But make sure these bases are covered, and make sure that you know which part of the battlefield you're on. It would be like you have a front line, then you have your a different group in a different part of the battlefield. You can't all go to the same part, right? Like, who's watching that side? Well, that was your job. So we all have a different role to play. Fix the mess. Stop the mess from continuing, right? Different roles, different responsibilities. So, I kind of gave this away, but did the rabbis just make these all up? No. Okay. Good. I think because we have a little foundation here, this would be an entirely different week to cover this. No. So the rabbis, Rabbi Yitzhak Breitowitz says, the Noahide laws are not Jews telling non-Jews what to do. It's God telling human beings what to do. It's just recorded in our books. Again, all humanity had this, but it became lost or corrupted. But the laws are preserved in the Torah. This is what Paul says. The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of the writings of God. We just happen to have it in our books. But what the Gentile world does with it is up to them. In fact, a lot of the kind of discussions in the Talmud about what happens if a Jew commits idolatry or a Gentile commits idolatry, there's really nothing the Jewish world has ever been able to do to a Gentile who commits idolatry, because they've always been in nations that are, for the most part, not run by Jews. Right? Even modern-day Israel is secular. There's a religious body that's influencing, but it's really just theoretical. What happens if a Jew worships an idol, right? Because like Mercury, for instance, you walk down the street and you throw rocks at Mercury when you pass it. That's how they worshipped. Jew would say, can we use those rocks? If they're a good rock, can I use that? No, you can't use that. What if a Gentile throws a rock? Like, technically, they're committing idolatry. They're breaking the Noahide laws, but what can we do about that? We're not in charge of them, right? That changes in a second, and we'll look at that. There is a Gentile the Jewish people do have some influence over. We'll talk about that. The rabbis derive these from a careful read. Often you'll see the word Adam, if a man were to commit X. Well, they say, well, Adam means humanity, so that looks like it's a command for humanity. And this starts to enter into the space of, well, can a Jew and a Gentile keep Shabbat? Well, there are laws about Shabbat for Jewish observance, but we see Shabbat before there was a Torah. So there is an aspect of keeping Shabbat that a Gentile is able to keep, right? It's not necessarily incumbent upon you. It's not part of, as some of the Psalms say, it's not part of the covenant, but it is open source. And I have heard some Orthodox rabbis say there is room for a Gentile to take part in Shabbat. But generally speaking, it's assuming you're keeping the Noahide laws. You're doing that baseline foundation and you're keeping yourself pure. Okay, so no, they didn't make it up. They went through a process, but the Jewish people are supposed to teach the Noahide laws to the nations. That's important. This is how the redemption, the Messianic redemption, arrives. Because remember, the more people that walk away from idolatry, the more people are now primed and ready to recognize the God of Israel, and the more people we now have to build that foundation for Messiah's kingdom. So it's important work. And of course, Gentiles can't do all of it, and Jews can't do all of it. It's a team effort. That's why Messianic communities, to me, are the closest thing to the redemption in our time, because we have the if we understand these roles, and if we understand what we can do and what we're not supposed to do, what we're supposed to avoid, we can do a lot of work in this space. Okay. Righteous Gentiles. Have we heard this term, Ager Toshav? Anyone that has not heard this term, it's okay if you haven't. Okay, good. This will be good. Let's say in the land of Israel there's a Sanhedrin, there's a temple, and Ralph, you wanted to move to Israel. You want to fish in the Galilee or whatever. You like it there. It's a beautiful place. You are now you're moving into a different category than the rest of the Gentile world who's outside of Jewish control. You would be expected to keep at least the Noahide mitzvot. And there are even rabbinic discussions that would expect a little bit more of you. And the way I read the Ger Toshav discussions, it's the Noahide laws plus a few more laws. Why would they give you more? What's the reason to make your life more difficult?
Because it's fun.
To ensure that I would comply with their requests.
Okay.
So there's a region in which, like, if you do something in the land of Israel, you would defile Israel, whereas it wouldn't defile your own land. It would defile the people. So, like, there are certain rules that apply to the community, regardless of if you're Gentile or Jewish in the space. So you have these commands, like in Leviticus, where it says, whether you or any of the people that sojourn in your midst, if you do this thing, you'll be cut off from among your people. It doesn't say from Israel, it says from your people. So there's a consequence, not just for Israel, but also from someone who sojourns in the midst. So you have these sojourner rules specifically like in Leviticus that show up again in Acts 15 that deal like with this type of dwelling in the midst of someone else in terms of Israel. So.
Excellent. So he said defilement in the beginning. And I want you to hold that thought in your mind. If I could take a word and just put it over here for the moment. Defilement and impurity. When you have a Ger Toshav, it's someone who now wants to be a part of the land of Israel. Now your behavior, this is also, by the way, a Ger Toshav is someone who's not Jewish, not a convert, but they're moving within proximity to the Jewish community in enough of a sense that you now have there's a different way of life here. There is a level of purity, right? There's a level of purity you have to keep because you could damage the holiness of this entire community, this entire land, really. Also known as the resident stranger, the resident alien, the pious among the Gentiles. And I think the word God-fearer is related here as well. And we see God-fearer in the New Testament. Paul addresses the audience at Antioch and he says, brothers, converts, fears of God, or men who fear God. So all of them could be in a community together. It's not just people who all believe the same thing, the different groups, ethnicities as well. a Gentile would go under a process for this. You would have to appear before some group of leaders and say, "Hey, I promise I'm going to take on these mitzvot. I'm going to do that because I want to be here." Maybe they liked the values. Maybe some of them are even in process to convert. Right? We see conversions in like the Clement homilies. He converts. Peter converts him. There are people who join and they say, "I just like the values better of this lifestyle better than the Roman Empire," or "Hey, I've realized that there is no God but one. So now I kind of want to be part of your people." Right? In Avodah Zarah, tractate Avodah Zarah 64, someone says, "Who's a ger toshav? Anyone who has accepted upon himself before three people, three pious religious leaders." So in this community, you would go to the elders, and you'd say, "I promise I want to take on the Noahide." They would also, and this is Rabbi Meir, who is actually a descendant of a convert himself, so he's very dialed into some of these issues. You see his name a lot. The Ger Toshav, though, actually took on more rules around idol worship. The rabbis felt like, okay, good, Noahide laws are great, but we actually expect a little bit more from you in terms of how you interact with your Gentile friends, because you're going to be part of that world and have a foot in our world. We have to be careful how much idolatry you're getting yourself into if you're going to come back into our community, because that can damage the sanctity of a community. And I'll show you some verses in a little bit. But this starts to really dial in what was going on at the Jerusalem Council. Overall, if you could put it in one sentence, what was the problem with the Jerusalem Council? What were they trying to solve? Okay, Dave.
Gentiles coming into the synagogues and worshiping with Jews, is my understanding.
Yep. Okay. Dave. I'll do Dave.
It was, in my sense of it, just there's a tertiary status that hadn't been existent yet, where like there's further inclusion into the community through Yeshua that wasn't present beforehand. And so what were the actual applicable rules? So it can be the same as Ger Toshav, or there could be differences and it hadn't been settled yet.
Yeah, you're both right. We've entered a new category, right? Now we have a new category of Gentile that's not pagan. They're not Jews. Some people say, "Oh, do we just convert them?" Simple. And we see that group all throughout the epistles, the circumcision. And from a halakhic standpoint, at that point, they weren't wrong. That was the standard at the time. And it also just made it a lot easier if you think about it. We take this group and we create a whole new category and a whole new need for rulings and interactions, and this is going to take a lot of time because every community is dealing with different numbers. Or convert them. We have thousands of years of instruction on how to do it at that point. And the big problem was table fellowship. You can't sit at the same table with an idolater if you're a Jew trying to preserve holiness. And in 1 Corinthians 10, you don't have to open any Bible, I'll read it to you. We see evidence of this. Paul says, "My friends, run from idolatry. I speak to you as a sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I'm saying. The cup of blessing over which we make the blessing, isn't it a sharing in the sacrifice and the death of Messiah? The bread we break, it's sharing in the body of Messiah." And he goes on, in this passage, he says that when people sacrifice to idols, they're actually sacrificing to demons. And there's impurity coming, and I can see you knew this verse. And he says you can't both drink from the cup of Messiah and the cup of demons. You can't partake in the meal of the Lord and the meal of demons. So he's trying to teach these people who are coming from a world where, hey, that's what we do. More days of the year than not, in the Roman Empire, you're involved in some idolatry and impurity. Because idolatry, think again back to the very first slide, that's what got us in trouble. So got Israel in trouble. They got exiled for that. So yes, to the Dave's points, we have now a Gentile group that is bringing a potential high level of spiritual impurity. Gentiles are under different rules of impurity, hence why the Jewish world has like physical, literal, you touch blood, you touch certain bodily fluids or carcasses. A lot of that doesn't seem to be incumbent upon Gentiles, hence why the Jewish people have different rules. And it endangers the sanctity of the community. So if somebody comes in the community, we don't think this way because we're modern people. We don't, we just don't, it doesn't occur to us. They're ever present of impurity. And communities, Jewish communities today still are, by the way. Hasidic and Orthodox communities are aware of impurity. It's in the Torah. We learn it. We don't study it very much here per se, but it is a factor. At the time, Jewish law, under the rulings of Shammai, you can look it up, called the 18 Measures. I think I thought about this a couple years ago. Basically created a lot of fences to keep Jews and Gentiles from interacting. And this is before the Mishnah was created. The Mishnah and the Talmud then kind of take the bearing of Hillel. But at this particular time in the first century, this little window of time, the entire New Testament happened. And it happened to be under the ruling of Shammai, who wanted no interactions with Gentiles because we just don't know what level of impurity we're bringing into the community. Avodah Zarah, you can read more about that if you want to. I think it's interesting. Read the technicalities of washing and rinsing things off. You'll see these discussions in the New Testament. You also see the issue with Peter. Peter's sitting at a table, and what happens when people who kind of hold the line of Shammai, they come into the community, Peter kind of gets out of there. Because he knows and he said it to Cornelius, it's not lawful for me to be interacting with you. Because at that particular time, that was a safeguard and technically it still is. It still is, because for a number of halakhic reasons, the 18 measures of Shammai are still kind of a thing to wrestle with. Okay. Last, the Gentiles would need some kind of instruction. Hey, if we're going to do this, because we do see some kind of change in these people that we've never seen before, right? Peter tells that story 3 times. Like, I saw them receive the Spirit. Wow, right? What do we do with them? So we're going to need new rules for the community.
I'm going to wait for you. So, okay. So when you think about the impurity laws, in a way, at that time they didn't have the types of medicine that we have right now. So in a way, God put those measures to keep them away from different types of bacteria, and because there's not the level of immunology and bacteriology, the knowledge regarding those at that time. So it kept the community safe.
And there is, right, so there is a degree of bacteria and kind of like biology there, but there's also, think of Yeshua, he teaches what causes impurity and defilement: lust, evil thoughts, right? There's always an ever-present spiritual aspect, and Gentiles are on the hook for that, which is why Paul continually doesn't teach about immersion so much, but he does teach them about how you interact with each other, loving each other, avoiding gossip, right? We do see spiritual impurity is something the Gentile world is on the hook for. And we will actually cover that in Acts 15 here. But we see this idea, Paul says it in Romans 6:19, for you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness. That's the problem with impurity. The Talmud teaches this as well. If you become impure, you become more susceptible to sinning and sinning and sinning, and you become darkened and darkened until, so Paul said, you used to be slaves to impurity and lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness. Now, present your members as slaves to righteousness and sanctification. So these verses will start to make sense in light of this idea of purity. Just pretend like it's over here. That is the big problem. We now have to figure out how to bring these people in. But it doesn't answer the question, do we convert them or not? Conversion is simple, but problematic. Even the rabbis in the Talmud say, you got to be careful converting people for a number of reasons. One, it's really difficult for people who haven't grown up in the Torah to keep all of the Torah commandments. Paul himself taught conversion. He says that. But then he later changes his mind because it's actually very difficult. You cause a lot of trouble for people. But you still see some people said it's necessary to circumcise them in order for them to keep the laws of Moses. Why? Because that avoids all that other stuff you have to deal with. It actually creates a barrier between them and the Gentile pagan world. Makes it simple. But they're reminded, some of the Gentiles, they weren't converts, they're not Jews, they weren't keeping the Torah, yet they had received some degree of divine presence. that wasn't believed largely to even be possible because of the state of impurity they were in. But they did it. So Peter says, I saw it, right? I witnessed it. And here's what they land on. I conclude we should not cause extra difficulty for the Gentiles who are turning to God. We should write to them to abstain from things defiled by idols, sexual immorality. You see these again, right? Immorality. What has been strangled or from blood. For Moses, who has had proclaimed in every town in ancient times, is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So they know they're going to learn more. The basic, bare minimum for these Gentiles to stay in our community is to keep these. Now, of course, people ask the questions. What about murder? What about theft? There are camps on this. Go ahead.
Well, oh, sorry. If you're
No, you go ahead.
From this categorization, my link has been going directly to Leviticus personally, and then the distinction between blood and things strangled. Things strangled has blood, but blood by itself has a common place throughout the Torah as meaning violence. And so, my personal take on it is that the blood is actually a reference to the theft, the violence, all those types of categories of things, whereas the others are directly related to the food, the idolatry, and sexual morality.
Okay, good. But you're recognizing that underlying this is the Noahide assumption?
I would go to Leviticus.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are camps. So, of course, if you go to gotquestions.com or org, whichever one it is, these are totally made up. But they admit that they are in the Bible. They're just not in a list. Okay, so that's a weird position. But it is kind of, when I worked in a church, never heard these mentioned, never heard these explained in any of the, hey, before you show up this Sunday to visit the church, make sure you're keeping these basic things, right? These were basically never spoken about. The reality of which is they've waned. A lot of people are not aware of them. If you tell people today that the apostles laid down at least 4 major categories, these are not simple things. How do you stay away from idols? What's defiled by idol? What do you mean defiled? Furniture, wine, meat, what? Now, the rabbinic tradition is very deep. Avodah Zarah is a very thick book. It's thick because they want interaction with the Gentiles, but they want to protect you. I was joking with Rabbi Peter in talking about this. If they wanted to make it simple, Avodah Zarah would be one line. Don't interact with anybody else. It would just be simple. But they know that there is going to be a time when you have to interact with people. Sexual immorality, that's like a broad category. And every new generation has new problems to figure out. Sexual immorality is no longer in person. It can be remote on a computer, right? So somebody would have to come along and kind of update these as we go. Does this count as sexual immorality? Yes. Our leadership board says it does, right? Okay, so there are camps. I said there's the camp that says this is all nonsense. We're forgiven. There's no sin. Nothing we can do wrong. Amen. Then there's the camp that says the Noahide laws were already extant in the community. For a Gentile to be in that community, to receive that letter, probably read by the community leaders to them from Paul, they would have already been keeping the Noahide laws. That kind of goes back to, some have pushed it back to the school of Hillel. Because Shammai said, no, just convert them. Hillel said, well, we got to kind of bring them in to some extent so that they can learn about God. We see that in Pirkei Avot. Teach the creation about Hashem. So these top 3 make sense. We can very easily connect them. Blood is a very different one, though. But I do want you, and I'll look at that in a second. All these bring significant impurity. All these are impure causes. The apostles are protecting the divine presence that the Gentiles had somehow received as a gift, miraculously, mysteriously. So they're trying to create protective boundaries for impurity. So keep that in mind. Okay, but the blood. The blood is a little weird. Roman culture drank blood. They drank gladiator blood. That's what they did. It's kind of a thing. In some cases, they also did it like other cultures, like the Canaanites and the Chaldeans, especially the Chaldeans. They engaged in drinking blood to summon demons. Weird. Leviticus 19:26 talks about that and actually groups that. You cannot consume blood. You cannot practice seeking knowledge of the future or the unknown using supernatural means. So God is connecting in the Torah drinking blood with divination. And of course in the Torah, and this goes back to what Dave was saying, the blood has the life force. There's a very specific thing in the Torah about blood and its chemical and spiritual makeup. But there's something interesting here. If you look at the various rabbinic discussions of kind of the bonus content thrown out as to what the Noahide laws should be, there's a rabbinic opinion that blood, consuming blood, should be one of them. There's also about sorcery in the same one, and then castrating animals. Now, all throughout, I mean, you can look at various books of Paul's letters, right? And he's talking about sorcery. You see the problem. But here we have a rabbinic opinion that aligns with the opinion of the apostles. There's a guy I follow. He remains anonymous. The book is called Esh Dot, and it talks about kind of the like if you want a very deep halakhic book that explains the New Testament, it's an author who is doing it from inside of Jerusalem, and he remains anonymous for obvious reasons. He makes a very compelling case, and I agree, because I think when you read Avodah Zarah, it kind of becomes more apparent what we're talking about with blood, but it also redefines Acts 15. So today you learn that Acts 15 is some way related to the Noahide laws. Well, it actually turns out if you kind of read Avodah Zarah, you kind of understand the halakhic expectation, and then you read Acts 15, they're giving you rabbinic level prohibitions. They're actually giving you fences on top of what would have already been expected, hence why some of the others are not mentioned. They could have been captured, like murder and theft. They could have been captured by Roman law, but the larger belief is that they would have already been keeping the Noahide laws. The apostles are saying, we want a little bit more. We think that you're probably going to lose this gift if we don't create some kind of protection for you. And what you see, actually, people say, oh, the rabbinic stuff, all those, the whole process is exactly what you do in a community. You appeal to leaders who vote, and they come up with a ruling, and they bind and loose depending on how they see fit, and then they establish that as a new footing for the community. And we see that here. So not only is the rabbinic process part of their thinking, they're actually taking the liberty to create extra bindings. Go ahead, Danny.
And just bolstering what you're saying, it is a specific command in the Torah that says, and I don't have chapter verse, that you can't give what's strangled to the foreigner that's in your midst. That's a direct contradiction to what they're saying in Acts if you read it just by face value. So clearly they're adding a prohibition there that's not standard.
But maybe you could give it to him, but you couldn't then eat with him.
Right.
Well, I think that the command in Torah is actually a reference to if someone's poor and a Gentile, which would go hand in hand in Israel in a lot of ways. So you can have mercy and bend some of the halakhic rules. But then if you're in like Gentile land in the diaspora, giving that to the same folks would be like, this is your land, you're probably not poor off. That doesn't make sense anymore. Like there's a inverse relationship to that in that space. So
I think that because they were introducing a new category of Gentile into their community and trying to smooth out the ability for them to eat together, I think there would have been an accompanying update for the Jewish people. Because there are many people who think that these letters of Paul aren't written to Jews at all, particularly Romans. And there are some really good studies. Mark Nanos, I think, is one of the big proponents of that. I think they would have turned to the Jewish community and said, hey, you guys, they're cool now, but we don't have that. We have a very specific set. This isn't all that there was. You can imagine a community, any one community is going to have different rulings and things they need to address. But we see this. We see that the Jerusalem Council ensured the observance of the Noahide laws, minimum participation. Now, we know that they were keeping more. We see throughout time they're taking part in Shabbat, they're taking part in the holidays, taking part in some kind of a Passover, more on the spiritual level, but they're there. Whatever was not spelled out was either covered by Roman law or was already in effect in the community. They seem to hold the Gentiles, followers of Yeshua, to a higher level than what was given. And I think we should recognize that this was a rabbinic process that led to rabbinic fences by the elders, the leadership. They were rabbis, they were teachers. that enable them to participate in more and create unity in the communities here. And I think I'm running out of time. Let me just share this last thing. Two last things. This is one. There's a rabbi from the 1700s, Rabbi Jacob Emden. He's often quoted by Orthodox and Kabbalist teachers that I follow. Really amazing rabbi, incredibly knowledgeable. Here's what he said. The Nazarene and his apostles never meant to abolish the Torah of Moses from one who was born a Jew. Likewise did Paul write in his letter to the Corinthians that each should adhere to the faith in which each was called. They therefore acted in accordance with the Torah by forbidding circumcision to Gentiles, according to the halacha, as it is forbidden to one who does not accept the yoke of the commandments. They knew it would be too difficult for the Gentiles to observe the Torah of Moses. Therefore, they, the apostles, forbade them to circumcise, and it would suffice that they observe the 7 Noahide commandments as commanded upon them through the halacha from Moses at Sinai. So he recognizes what's going on. If you're looking at this from a Jewish perspective, aware of the parameters of Jewish law, they're basically giving them Noahide laws as a baseline. Now, they had the opportunity. They could have said, yeah, let's just make them keep the whole Torah like we do. They didn't, though. Right? We have to wrestle with that because there was not much given in the last 2,000 years. This idea has kind of waned. As I said, I've been in Catholic churches growing up and Protestant churches. I worked in one. And you don't hear these spoken about because it's kind of fallen away. And of course, the Jewish world has largely been on the defensive, managing its own things that we have a 2,000-year lapse of what that looks like today because a lot of the Noahide laws are more or less baked into our society today. Right? We can look at them and say, okay, a good deal of them are more or less baked in. Some are not, though. Sexual immorality. We could be more careful with that. Everybody can be more careful with that, right? So I'm going to fast forward here. Yes. Okay, I'll just do this one. 2,000 years ago, that was the ruling. It was a framework, but what do we do now? Right? I think the Messianic community owes itself a little bit of an update. We need to sit down and maybe work with the Jewish community and understand what this looks like. Learn the process. I think that is also something we need to do. Many Gentiles are learning higher dimensions of Torah. I know many of you do. You study way outside of what people 2,000 years ago would have done. What does that look like now? Now you're in a whole new world. Well, there is a belief in, the Lubavitcher Rebbe pushed this idea, Gentiles need to learn all of it. We're now in the very edge of time before the Messianic era, as Brad alluded to earlier in his message. We need to start diving in, Musar. We need to start learning some of these hidden dimensions that weren't available to prior generations, and then apply them, become more spiritually attuned people. Because as we get more people who are no longer involved in idolatry and who support Israel, and people are being tested in that today, we can see that, we are paving the way for the Messianic era. Last thing, and I'll end it here. So what we do is make sure we understand which laws are incumbent upon us. When we're repenting in the month of Elul and we're getting ready for Yom Kippur, and we're saying sorry for the sins and we're being careful, know which ones we are talking about. Some we're on the hook for, some we aren't. Depends on who you are. And as Brad said, even if you're Jewish, there's still Kohanim, men, women, where it differs. But if you're Gentile, you know what your list is. Uphold them the best you can. Take on a new mitzvah. Repent for the ones that maybe you didn't even know you had to repent of, or you didn't know that you were on the hook for. And everyone across the board can continue to learn Musar, acts of kindness, charity, and these things. And that's what Paul's lessons are mostly about. Paul is largely teaching, assuming people are in the community, keeping the Noahide plus. Then he's teaching them how to interact with each other. Musar, derech eretz, like we studied about 9 months ago or so. And that's all I have. Any questions?